has worked on the wide range of policy issues that CPR has worked on over the decades, to think both about where India has come, so looking backwards at the policy journey that has unfolded over decades, but also to push us to think harder about some of the big and profound challenges that we confront across multiple domains as we look to the future. We've had the privilege of several colleagues who've spoken in this lecture series, who have both played an important role in shaping this institution and also shaping the ideas and public discourse on issues that they have worked on. So it's only fitting that Mr. Harish Damodran is here today to speak to us. Harish is an old friend of CPR's. And much of what CPR knows about rural affairs and agriculture owes everything to Harish's work and the patience with which he has debated, discussed, dialogued. Often we've also, like all good debaters, found ourselves ready for blows. We've nearly come to blows and then found a point of consensus along the way. But it's really been incredible for all of us at CPR, across many generations of us, how much we have learned. And there's almost no one in the country that is as excited about the different types of protein, and particularly pulses and meats and chicken, their prices, milk prices, the volatility of these prices, and how this affects all of our everyday lives. So every time I start complaining about how quickly the money is finishing from my wallet as I'm making these purchases. I look at the stream of articles that Harish has written over the week to better understand what's happening to food prices and inflation, particularly in the last few months. So really, Harish, it's such a pleasure. Harish spent a year with us on his sabbatical in the midst of COVID 2020 as a faculty member at CPR. And since then, very generously agreed to stay visiting faculty at CPR and contribute in no small measure to much of what we have done over these last few years on agriculture and rural development. He is, of course, best known as the Rural Affairs and Agriculture editor at the Indian Express. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with his byline, but it really is where you need to go to really understand what's happening in India today. Harish is going to speak to us as we were sort of debating how to frame his lecture. Unfortunately, we lost a stalwart, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan. And so Harish said it would only be fitting that today's lecture be in memory of Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, remembering his enormous contribution and all that we have learned from him. The lecture is titled From Green to Evergreen Revolution. So much of the conversation we've also had with you, Harish, in the last year, or the last 2-3 years, especially after COVID, as the farm laws, etc., came, we spent a lot of time thinking back to the pact that the Green Revolution forged for food security and with our farmers, and thinking harder about the big questions we need to ask about the next sort of 2.0 of revolution that India is on the cusp of. So really, this is also for all of us at CPR a wonderful opportunity to once again learn from you as we think through these big questions for so much of our work. So thank you so much, Harish, for being here and for agreeing to do this lecture. And over to you.
Yeah, so if we can have the, yeah. Yeah, so I think last week, farm unions in Jalandhar, they conducted an Akhand Path, and Akhand Bhog, Path Bhog and Antim Ardas ceremony, to pay tributes to and condolences to Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, whom I think they called as Kisanan da Masiha. and so this was at a Gurudwara, in Punjab. So, and they said that the best tribute to him would be by implementing the Swaminathan committee report, and the whatever, the C2, yeah, the comprehensive cost and 50% plus. So I think the best way to pay tribute to Dr. Swaminathan is basically to talk about the Green Revolution and and the journey of the Green Revolution. I mean, including how, I mean, I think how he conceptualized it. So the topic is from the green to evergreen revolution, or you can also say Green Revolution 1.0 to Green Revolution 2.0. Okay. Not able to.
It's not showing.
Yeah.
Let me see, why is it not showing?
Yeah. Second.
Apologies.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm
The
not
first
sure
one, the
what
first
we
one, yeah,
did,
that's okay.
but
Yeah.
okay.
So the Green Revolution 1.0, and we know that it was all around. I mean, it's basically about wheat and rice, and basically it had to do with how to change the architecture of the plants. The traditional varieties were tall, 4.5 to 5 feet, slightly shorter than me, and with very long and very weak stems. Yeah. And so they grew vertically on application of chemical fertilizers and water, and when their barley, basically the earheads which bear the flowers and eventually the grain, and so when they would become heavy, with full grains, they would bend over, what they call as lodging, even falling flat on the ground. So the yields were very low. They could not respond to fertilizers. You apply fertilizers, they grow straight and they just lodge. And the typical yields were about 1 ton per hectare in the case of wheat, and say around the same thing for paddy. So the challenge at that time was to breed new varieties which were non-lodging, and they could be responsive to fertilizer and water application, and the general, rule of the thumb is, to produce 1 ton of wheat, you need to apply 25 kg of nitrogen. So if you want to raise wheat yields to 4 tons, you want to quadruple yields, so then you have to basically apply 100 kg of nitrogen. Okay, and same thing in the case of paddy. I think 15 to 20 kg nitrogen for 1 ton of paddy. So basically, you need to apply about 100 to 120 kg of nitrogen per hectare. And so basically, more input, that is water and nutrients, more output. Whereas the existing varieties couldn't even tolerate 40 to 50 kg per hectare of nitrogen. So the solution, as I said, it was to basically change the architecture of the plant, to enable them to absorb more nitrogen and convert this into grain. So it had to be, you needed to be semi-dwarf, with strong stems that would hold the panicles. The same thing, the barley, upright, even when you give very high fertilizer dosages, and so the panicles themselves were to be large enough. So as I said, so short plants but big panicles. That is chote paudhe magar bade bali. It had to be both. It couldn't be chote paudhe or chote bali. It had to be both. And that is what the architecture of the plants had to be. And the source of it in the case of wheat, and this is the very interesting part, it came from all over the world. So when you see the genes, how they traveled, in wheat, they came from a variety called Norin 10. It was bred in 1935 and nobody knew about it. Somebody in Japan, he bred it. And basically it had these two genes, RHT1 is basically reduced height, so reduced height genes, and it was bred by somebody in Japan, and it was there. And it was identified by this person called Samuel Cecil Salmon, and he was in the US. He was attached to the US Army, which we know that Douglas MacArthur ran Japan, I think, post-World War from 1945 to 1951. So he saw this variety. He was very intrigued by this, this Norin-10 genes. So he took the seeds, and he gave them to the scientist called Orville Vogel, who was in Washington State University. He was actually a USDA breeder who was based in Washington State University. So it went from Japan, it went to the US. Okay, and Vogel crossed Norin-10 with the local US wheats, which were basically winter wheats. In the US, the wheats are of the winter background, and one of the crosses it was released, and it was called Gaines. It had 25% higher yields. So you cross Norin-10 with the local US wheats, and you get very high yields. And what Vogel did is he also shared the seeds of Norin-10 with Norman Borlaug, who was at that time based in Mexico. He was with the Rockefeller Foundation and working on the Mexico, and he was with the Mexico Agriculture Program. Okay, and Borlaug crossed the same, the Norin-10 with the wheats which are grown in Mexico, which were basically your spring wheats, like the ones which we grow in India. Okay, and by the early 60s, he had bred and released these varieties. The famous varieties, which were Sonora 63, 64, Lerma Rojo 64A. So this was what has happened so this is what happened. So from Japan, then it goes to the US, and from US it goes to Mexico. Okay, and in rice, similarly, I'll come to Dr. Swaminathan in a while, but similarly, you had in rice, you had again a dwarfing gene. The source of it was just like the Norin-10. Here you had a variety called DGWG, DGO gen. It was grown in Taiwan. Probably, I don't know, again, these were obscure, and this was identified, and it had this gene SD1. SD1 is semi-dwarfing, gene, so just like there you had RHT, which is reduced height gene. Here it was a semi-dwarfing gene, and it was identified by these two scientists who were in IRRI, International Rice Research Institute, and this was founded by Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation. So you had Norman Borlaug, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and here you had IRRI, which was Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, and these two scientists, they crossed the DGWG with a tall Indonesian variety, and that resulted in IR8. And IR8 was grown in India also. And that was released in 1966. So you see, from 4.5 to 5 feet, it comes down to 3 feet, and plus it had a higher grain straw ratio. The traditional this thing, just 30% was grain and 70% was straw. It was basically straw and giving a bit of grain, whereas here it was basically 50-50, and it matured in hardly 130 days. So you bringing it down, and the yields were 4.5 to 5 tons, and I think at that time they showed that the more nitrogen you give, the more the yields. It could go up to 9 tons. So from 1.5 tons, you go to, you can go up to, 5 tons was, I think, the normal this thing. So you had rice, and you had wheat, and you had the Norin-10 wheat from Japan, and then you had this thing. So Dr. Swaminathan was in IARI. Okay, he joined as an assistant cytogeneticist at IRI's division of botany. This was in October 1954. It's very interesting that his work prior to coming to IRI was basically in potato. Okay, while doing his PhD in Cambridge University and also postdoctoral research in Wisconsin, he published extensively, on the genetics of potato, including in the American Potato Journal. And his focus was on breeding potatoes against pest diseases and various abiotic stresses, like frost, frost tolerance, and in fact, he even bred a hybrid potato, that was later on called Alaska frostless, which basically it was a cross between cultivated potato, which is basically Solanum tuberosum, and a wild relative. And he showed that when you cross the two, so basically the wild relative had genes which were resistant to frost. And this particular hybrid was later on released as Alaska frostless. So his work was basically on potato. So Dr. Swaminathan was basically an aloo man, not a gehu man. Okay, so it was something like Dr. Gurudev S. Khush. Dr. Khush's PhD research at University of California Davis was on rye, and rye is actually a cereal crop closely related to wheat and barley, and Dr. Khush's postdoctoral work was on tomato. Actually, so I think I'm basically mapping and exploring the tomato genome, all the 12 chromosomes. So in a recent interview, Dr. Khush told me that he actually saw properly a paddy field only after he arrived in Erie, as a 32-year-old, and this greatest of rice breeders of all times, he even told me that he doesn't like rice, and he any day prefers wheat and chapati, etc. So that's like Dr. Verghese Kurian, I mean, Verghese Kurian disliked milk, he could never get himself to drink it. So what is interesting is Dr. Swaminathan came from, potato, nothing to do with wheat. Okay, and Dr. Kurian hated milk, and Dr. Khush, he was basically a rye and a tomato man who came into rice. But I think fundamentally all the three were basically very restless characters. After Dr. Swaminathan came to IARI, he started working on, he said that we should start working on breeding semi-dwarf varieties, because he realized that, that is the future. He said that which were, responsive to fertilizer usage, and he tried to achieve this dwarfing in wheat, through what is called mutation breeding. That is basically exposing wheat plants to radiation to basically induce the desired changes in the DNA. But the strategy didn't click, because what he found is that when you reduce the height of the wheat plants, the panicles also became short. So exactly the same problem, which, as I said, wo chote pode or chote bali, but he heard about the Norrin-10 gene around 1955 from this well-known Japanese wheat geneticist by the name of Hitoshi Kihara. And then Dr. Swaminathan wrote to Vogel, and at that time he was barely 30 years old. Okay, he wrote to Vogel, and Dr. Vogel then advised him, look, it's better you approach Borlaug. I mean, I can give you Gaines wheat, but Gaines wheat won't flower in Indian conditions. It may flower in Srinagar, in Shimla, in Mussoorie, but not in Sehor or in Ludhiana or in Kanpur. So he said that it's better you approach Dr. Borlaug, because he has bred it in a spring wheat background. And so then Dr. Swaminathan, actually Dr. Swaminathan even read a paper on the Norrin dwarfing genes by Orville Vogel in the American Journal of Agronomy. So it only shows how abreast he was. Sitting in IARI, he knew what kind of work was happening. And then he told Dr. B.P. Pal that we should invite Dr. Borlaug to India and all, but took some 2 years, I mean, for the invitation, everything to go. So finally, I think IARI in 1962 requested Rockefeller Foundation, please to spare Borlaug. So Dr. Borlaug visited in India, March 1963. So both Dr. Swaminathan, Dr. Borlaug, Dr. M.V. Rao, many of them, they traveled, across, Punjab, Haryana, all the wheat growing areas, and all these things. So March 1963, Dr. Borlaug comes to India. And in October 1963, Dr. Borlaug sent about 100 kg of seeds of those 4 Mexican varieties, those Sonora 63, Sonora 64, Lerma Rojo 64A. Okay, and these were sown, in 1963, 1964. In November 1963, they were sown in IRI, in Pantnagar, Kanpur, in all the multi-locational this thing, and the results were very good, And then Dr. Swaminathan said we should straight away now plant it in farmers' fields. Okay, and he said that we should go for so he wanted about 1,000 national demonstrations. He said we'll go straight into the farmers' fields. Okay, and there were obviously a lot of objections. Okay, and even then, you had the officials. They said let's do 4 years trial, 5 years trial. But Dr. Swaminathan was very persistent, and he had worked his connections very well, and like Mr. Bhuthalingam was his father-in-law, okay, and through him probably he knew Mr. B. Shivaraman, and I think by then C. Subramaniam had he had also become the agriculture and food minister, So I think around Dr. Swaminathan pushed for this farmer field trials in June 1964, and I think C. Subramaniam he overruled all objections of the officials, and I think he cleared it in August 1964, and in November 1964 these were first sown in this village called Jonti. So just look at it. I mean, March 1963, Dr. Borlaug sends those, he comes to India. September 1963, he sends he sends those seeds. Then they are tested in 1963. 1964 season, and 1964 season, farmers started. They sowed it, and they harvested, 4 to 4.5 tons. I mean, it was like many farmers then called it, chamatkar. That is what happened in Jonti village. Because I happened to go there, a few years back. I mean, it was very interesting. I mean, where the seeds of the Green Revolution were actually sowed. Then, of course, we know that in 65, 66, we faced, consecutive droughts. Our food grain production, from about 83 million tons, it collapsed to, hardly 73 million tons. And we had to import, I think the imports peaked at about 10.4 million tons in 1966, as they call it. It was a ship-to-mouth existence. And that was when a political decision was taken, to import. It was the largest shipment of seed ever imported in history, right? And 18,200 tons, and I think Dr. Swaminathan ensured. I think he pushed his father-in-law to spare the foreign exchange, to import this entire, this 18,200 tons. So so it's very important to have connections, and I think and I think that's how. So when it came, whether it was to do with conducting the national demonstrations, or whether it was to import, 18,000 tons is huge, to import, and the risks, whereas today you look at it, our genetically modified crops, look at Dr. Paintel's genetically modified mustard. You compare Dr. Paintel's connections to Dr. Swaminathan. There's absolutely no, there's absolutely no this thing. Okay, but I suppose at that time, probably I think this was something like the COVID vaccine, right? Nobody here said that COVID vaccines you should try for 5 years, 5-year trial. Straight away we went for it, right? So we were in that kind of a situation because it was a question of starvation, right? So 10 million tons you could not have imported. So just like in the case of COVID vaccine, so probably because of that, and then you see from 73 million tons, our food grain output shot up to 95 million tons, and and basically it was led by wheat, because wheat production more than doubled. It doubled in hardly 4 years, and that is what happened. And just like you had Jonti village, in the case of IR8, it was first tested in this village in West Godavari, in the farm of this particular person, N. Subbarao. He's still alive, right? Okay. So he's still alive. Yeah. And and this is what happened. And of course, initially it was all the Mexican dwarf varieties which were imported, and the grain was all red in color, not very suited for making chapatis, and I think our scientists, basically it was Dr. Athwal and I think Dr. Athwal and Dr. Mathur, probably they were the ones, I think, who first developed this Kalyan Sona and Sonalika. It was actually more selection. It was not breeding, and these were not red. These were amber colored and with better chapati making quality. And so if you look at Green Revolution 1, it was largely public sector led, so both domestic and international. So international, you had both CIMET and IRRI. And Dr. Kush, I mean, if you look at his varieties, I mean, IR36 and IR64, each of them were planted in about 10 to 11 million hectares worldwide during the 1980s, 90s, more than any food crop, in history. And interestingly, that record was broken by this variety called HT2967, which was bred by Dr. Prabhu. In fact, I think Dr. Prabhu is he's there in today's Zoom meeting. And so if you look at it, I mean, our wheat yields have risen. I mean, see, Kalyan Sonalika, it went to 4 to 5 tons. So it's not that. So and we have about now 7 tons plus. So there has been continuous improvement in yields. And plus, our scientists have been breeding for pest and disease resistance. Wheat is very susceptible to rusts, the rust fungus, and in rice, similarly, I think these two have been our great blockbuster varieties, Swarna and Samba Masuri. And these were again bred by these scientists from Andhra Pradesh Agricultural University. I think later on it became Acharya N.G. Ranga Agricultural Universities, So the role, so Green Revolution 1 was, about, as I said, it was a global partnership, and at that time, there was no problem with sharing of genetic material, etc. I mean, your genes could flow from Japan to US to Mexico to India without, there was no IPR and those kind of things, So maybe it had to do with the geopolitics of that time, So probably the US was very scared that hunger would lead to communist revolutions everywhere, so they wanted to, so there was this entire thing about doing good, so probably it had to do, I'm not an expert on geopolitics, but probably this was one of the reasons. And the US took a lot of interest in developing our agricultural universities, and that too through the public sector, and so if you see about 8 universities, which were set up in the 1960s, these were all modeled on the US land grant model, and so you see these things, and these were all, I mean, imagine 8 universities in 8 years. I mean, it was remarkable, and entirely with the US collaboration. So it is not that India was totally, a satellite of the Soviet Union or something, So we were, I think in agriculture, we owe it a lot to the Americans, and if you see, like these are all partnerships between with American land grant universities, whether it was Illinois, whether it was Missouri, and like in the case of PAU, it was the mentoring university was Ohio State University, and so I would say that the public sector breeding has delivered in other crops too, and for example, in the case of basmati rice. In fact, it's very important to note that it was Dr. Swaminathan. In the case of basmati, it was Dr. Swaminathan who initiated the basmati breeding program while he was the IRI director. He said that we should be able to breed varieties which will combine traditional basmati's unique grain attributes, basically aroma, non-stickiness, elongation upon cooking, with the, you should combine it with the high yielding background of the modern dwarf variety. So it was Dr. Swaminathan who started that program. So if you look at it, I think Pusa Basmati 1 was released in 1989, and it was basically Dr. Siddiq, and so and after that you had Pusa 1121, which is so if you look at it, about almost $5 billion of exports of basmati, and 95% of it is from IARI, so 1121, and off late you have 1509, and which has been bred by Dr. A.K. Singh. And you look at it across crops, Dr. Bakshi Ram, Dr. Bakshi Ram has totally changed the face of the US, of Uttar Pradesh's sugar industry through his through his sugarcane variety called yes. Yes, cocoa. Yes. So and same thing. So Dr. C.T. Patel was the first. He bred the world's first ever hybrid cotton, H4. It is called Shankar 4. And it was bred, I think, in 1970. So these are all results of public sector breeding. And so Green Revolution 1, you had R&D, and there were other government interventions also, whether it was setting up fertilizer plants, which were mostly in the public and cooperative sectors, whether it was National Fertilizers, Rashtriya Chemicals Fertilizers, FACT, everything. And of course, this was very important, declaring, MSPs, and establishing APMC mandis within bullock cart distance. That was actually based on a Ford Foundation, report. They said that you should establish these mandis everywhere, so that farmers can just go and sell. So it was a US conspiracy. You can say it. It was not. It has nothing to do with socialism. So and of course, FCI was set up in 1966. Again, I think C. Subramaniam was the main person. Of course, Dr. Swaminathan was there. He was running it, behind the scenes kind of a thing. And then, of course, White Revolution was through, National Dairy Development Board. So this was the Green Revolution. Now comes the private sector. Okay. So the private sector, the guys, they were totally marginal players, till the 80s, till the 80s, they were totally, not very big players, So you had Mr. Barwale, of Mexico. So he actually started off as a seed producer and multiplier of publicly bred varieties, like Pusa Savani, it was a Bhindi variety which was bred by this IARI scientist called Dr. Harbhajan Singh. Okay, and I think Mr. Barwale started growing this Pusa Savani in his farm. Then I think Dr. Harbhajan Singh told him, look, don't grow it for the fruit. Why don't you allow the fruits to ripen sufficiently, and then you collect the seeds for selling. And he started selling the seeds, under his own brand called, I think, Safal. Okay, and then and Mr. Barwale was actually originally, he was an engine oil dealer. He was a Castrol and Burma Shell engine oil dealer who actually came to the seed business by accident. Okay, and then he started becoming, all the publicly bred, including hybrids, even Shankar 4 cotton, which I told you about, about Dr. C.T. Patel's this thing. So I think the ICAR institutes like IARI would supply, basically the genetically pure nuclear seeds of the male and female parental lines, and then he would cross these lines, for producing first the breeder seeds and foundation seeds in his farm, and then he would supply the foundation seeds to farmers to commercially multiply them, and then he would then sell those seeds, and he was selling it under his own brand. Then in the 80s, Mexico started its own hybrid breeding program. By this time, Mr. Barwale's son and daughter, they were. I think Raju Barwale was from Pantnagar, and so they started their own hybrid breeding program. And there were basically three companies, which were basically in the private sector. You had Indo-American Seeds, Rasi Seeds, yeah. So the MNCs start coming only from the 1990s, and that is with maize and cotton. Okay, and the MNC who came first were actually, it started off in maize, so it started with Cargill and Pioneer. Pioneer was taken over by DuPont. Okay, and then I think DuPont merged with Dove Chemicals, and then I think finally they hived off their business, and I think now it's called Corteva. So in 1997-98, Monsanto tied up with Mexico. Okay, and Dr. Swaminathan had a role there also. He was a person who apparently introduced Rob Fraley of Monsanto to the Mexico people. So again, see, Dr. Swaminathan saw, he was like Lord Krishna. He could see the future. How it should be. So whether it was the Green Revolution, and in the case of cotton, etc., he was convinced that if it is hybrids, it has to be pushed by the private sector. So he was, in that way, he was non-ideological. He saw what was practical. He felt that, come on, we should now push it through the private sector. This is a story which not many people know about it. Okay. And so Monsanto also entered maize in the late 90s. Okay, and in the 2000s, I think this is when the private seed industry really, became big. Any crop amenable to hybridization, whether it is cotton, vegetables, bajra, and these are the kind of penetration levels now you see. Like about 60 to 70% of maize is now all hybrids. And entirely with private seed companies. And most vegetables, whatever we get now, it is all, whether it is bhindi, whether it is cauliflower, karela, everything is all hybrid, except potato and onion. Everything else, tomato, etc. And this is totally, a very large share is basically MNCs, so whether it is Nunhems, whether it is Seminus, and Syngenta, and so it's 50% MNCs, 50% is Indian companies, your Mexico, Namdhari, Rasi, etc. And in hybrid maize also, it is basically, as I said, Pioneer, which is Corteva, and the rest is with Indian firms, and hybrid rice is a new segment. Last 20 years, entirely, it's entirely controlled by Bayer, very, very big, and Corteva is there also. Okay. And these are the various estimates which I've got from the industry. It's about 15,000 crore is the size of the private seed industry. And if you see like what has happened, like for example the corn, our output has doubled, and entirely because of private sector single cross hybrids. It's the public sector has had hardly any role here. And if you go to Bihar, if you go to the Kosi belt, you will find many farmers harvesting 50 quintals per acre, which is higher than what farmers in Iowa and Illinois, etc., harvest. It's remarkable when you go to places like Katihar and Purnia, etc., the kind of yields which those farmers get, and it's entirely because of single cross hybrids of mainly of Bayer and Corteva. And tomatoes, like when I came first to Delhi, I could never get tomatoes during summer. During summers, we used to get only tinda and maybe a few other vegetables. But you get we started complaining when tomato prices in summer went up to 200 rupees, whereas earlier they were simply not available, right? And today, yeah. And if you go to Kolar and parts of Maharashtra, you find farmers who are growing 3 crops of tomato, Kharif, Rabi, and also a summer tomato, and 30 to 45 tons. There are people who even get 50, 55 tons, and these are all again, private hybrids. And pardon? Per hectare, yeah. No, sorry, per acre. Per acre, per acre. These are all per acre.
55 tons per acre.
Yeah. But vegetables, you always get those kind of yields. Whereas the best.
This is not right. This is the wet.
Yes. And the best wheat for the best paddy farmer may get about, say, the 35 quintals per acre, right? And whereas the worst tomato farmer may get, 10 tons, so it's just this thing, and because of hybrid, yeah. So, and if you see again, even agronomic technologies, I mean, one I said about the seeds, so you look at whether it is drip irrigation, laser land leveling, and like what, for example, you look at what Jain irrigation did to bananas, both through drip irrigation and also, high density planting, basically tissue cultured plants, and today, if Jalgaon district was a separate country, it would be the world's 7th largest banana republic, and that's what has come. And Jalgaon is a dry area. I mean, whereas normally when we talk of banana republic, it's all coastal, lot of rains, right? I mean, slave labor, etc. Right? I mean, that is the normal this thing. Whereas we achieved this in a semi-arid area, in Jalgaon. And same is the case with your broiler and this thing. So these have all come through the private sector. So basically you have the public sector still in open pollinated varieties, wheat, rice, sugarcane, soybean, in those crops, whereas the private has come, and this has come in the last 20-25 years. It started off with Mr. Barwale, and you see there is what is happening. Okay, so as I was recently with just a few days with Pallav Bagla, he's a science journalist. So we were saying that Dr. Swaminathan was the Lord Krishna of Indian agriculture, because he sees the future. Okay, he knows what is in the interest of agriculture. So this is in 1968, and this is an article which he wrote in Indian Farming, and see, he's talking about the dangers of monocropping. Right? How you're probably going to get more more diseases when you grow the same variety, and large contiguous areas. Okay. And in the same January 1968, I don't know, in January 1968, he seemed to have had some kind of a revelation kind of a thing, and he spoke at the Indian Science Congress, and you see, he talked about natural farming, so he said, what are the dangers, of if you do this intensive cultivation of land, and using the same unscientific tapping of underground water. I mean, this is in 1968, I mean, he knew the future, so I think that is what Dr. Swaminathan was, someone who should know what is going to happen in Indian agriculture 50 years from now, who will know. I think that is the greatness of that man, I mean, he could see the future, so he is definitely, I mean, you can call him prophet, you can call him Lord Krishna, anything, it's this thing. So now I'll come to the Green Revolution 2 or whatever, this is not evergreen, but this is basically, it is a fading green which is happening. Of course, I mean, Green Revolution 1.2 has made India more than self-sufficient, and I think COVID was its finest hour came during this time. I mean, the first ever disaster where people didn't die of starvation. I mean, they were income losses, job losses, but nobody died on the streets, for lack of food, and this is a great, I mean, it's a tremendous achievement, I mean, and you look at the PDS rice and wheat sales, I mean, something like, 100 million tons of rice and wheat you are able to give out free, I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, whereas we were importing, so I think this is something which was a remarkable thing. And during these last 3 years, we also, I mean, even after giving out grain free, we also exported about 75 million tons of rice and wheat, so from ship to mouth imported to surplus exporter, so for this, definitely, I think we should thank Dr. Swaminathan and the great scientists along with him. In fact, in a previous slide, I've talked about, those. I just wanted to mention those scientists, who were the great wheat breeders. I think Dr. V.S. Mathur, Dr. S.P. Kohli, Dr. Atwal. These are all unrecognized people, forgotten people today. And whereas actually Dr. Swaminathan didn't do the breeding. As I said, all his breeding wasn't basically in potato. He had nothing to do with wheat in that sense, right? I mean, whereas the men who did the breeding, they are all forgotten people, So yeah, so that is the thing, okay? But basically the strategy was, more input, more output. That is the strategy, So you breed semi-dwarf varieties, where and which are responsive to fertilizer, that is, they won't lodge, if I give fertilizer, it will not, they won't bend, and so they will be able to absorb. But if you see over a period of time, the crop yield response has actually, more than halved. 1 kg of NPK, which was applied through chemical fertilizers, it was yielding about 12 kg of cereals at one time. This is the Indian data, and that has fallen to, it was more than halved. So the response has not been good enough. So as I said, the dwarfing genes enable farmers to apply more fertilizers, but yields aren't rising like before, sometimes even falling. So instead of more input, more output, it is actually more input, same output. That is what is happening. So why is it happening? And it basically has to do with, basically you're giving more food, but too much of a single nutrient and too less of other nutrients. Like, for example, they say that the ideal NPK ratio should be 4:2:1, whereas in Punjab it is 26:6:1, so and the imbalance is even more when it comes to, I mean, this is just the NPK, there is nitrogen, potash, and phosphorus and potash. And the secondary nutrients, it's very bad: sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and micronutrients. It is even more. So basically, what is happening is when you are just giving one nutrient, so basically it is not getting so it is not working well, because you're not giving other nutrients. So, and that is measured by what is called the nitrogen use efficiency, so which is basically the proportion of nitrogen which is applied that is utilized by crops. Nitrogen basically has to convert into ammonium, and so for it to be utilized by the crops. And this has fallen. So basically, when, as we said earlier, to produce 6 tons of paddy, 1 ton of paddy, you need say 20 kg of nitrogen. So therefore, when you give 120 kg, you produce 6 tons of paddy. But actually, the plant is not getting 120 kg. It is only getting 40 kg. The rest, 80 kg, is actually unavailable to the plant. Okay, it is not being utilized by the plant. And this is the nitrogen use efficiency, which you can see in the case of India, it has fallen, or rather flattened to, about 34-35%. So basically, when you're applying urea, only 35% is being actually utilized by the plant. The rest is going unutilized. Okay, whereas it is higher in where you can see in the case of Northern America, it has been going up. So which means the farmers there are applying more balanced nutrition. They're not giving just nitrogen; they're also giving other, probably micronutrients and everything. Whereas India is a case where it has been falling. And so what is happening? So basically, as I said, when you apply urea, that urea, basically the nitrogen is first converted into ammonia, and then when ammonia reacts with water, it forms ammonium. So ammonium is what is being actually absorbed by the plants. Whereas here, what is happening is it is forming ammonia gas, and it is not converting because you are putting too much of it, and that ammonia gas is getting released into the atmosphere. So that is what is called above the ground losses, and plus the ammonia is also getting converted into nitrate, and that is going below the ground. So you have both below the ground losses and above the ground losses, through you have both nitrification and volatilization. So that means, so if only 40 kg of the 120 kg, which I said, is being used, so where is it getting the remaining 80 kg? It is just that you're using more urea. You're using, so instead of 120 kg of nitrogen, you are applying 200 kg of nitrogen. Okay, and also some of this unutilized nitrogen actually goes into the, it forms your soil organic reserves. It goes into the reserves and basically in the organic form. And then it gets converted into the mineralized form, the ammonium form, and it becomes available to the subsequent crop. So basically, the crop which I am planting now, it is getting some of the nitrogen from the previous crop. Whatever has been whatever urea which I applied in the previous, so some of that is coming and is being utilized. And then there is also some decomposed root biomass containing the nitrogen. So this is what is happening. So this is how, so farmers are applying excess urea and also getting some of the nitrogen, which of the unutilized nitrogen, which is getting utilized in this case. Okay. So, and this is the case, this is in the scenario which Dr. Swaminathan projected, the mining of nutrients, the deterioration of soil health. And that comes precisely because of, using only, a single, more and more of a single nutrient, So the quantity of nutrients which are being removed, which are being used by the crops is far exceeding what you're recycling back into the soil. And that is why, as I said, in Haryana, in the paddy, 200 kg per hectare of nitrogen is being used, whereas you need to use only about 120 kg of nitrogen. And so environmentally, obviously, it's not sustainable. Financially, fiscally, also not, because India, unlike other countries, we don't have any natural gas. We don't have, I mean, we have sunlight, we have water, we have soil, but we don't have any minerals. We don't have gas, we don't have potash, we don't have any of this thing. And I've estimated that if you add the finished fertilizers plus all these inputs, your phosphoric acid and everything together, I think we spend something like $30 billion, and on top of it, we are also subsidizing. So there are two costs. One is the foreign exchange, which is being spent, and the other is, whatever, 2 lakh crore of the fertilizer subsidy. So this is clearly not sustainable, both environmentally and financially. So now we come to the evergreen revolution, So what should be the, strategy? The strategy clearly has to be less input and more output. It means, you have to focus more on, input use efficiency. You basically, you produce more output from less fertilizer and less water. So I would say that this is what the evergreen revolution should be. And I'm sure if Dr. Swaminathan was younger, he would have pursued this with the same zeal, with the same, and again, he would have pushed all his connections, everybody, he would have done exactly in the way he did it in the 50s and 60s. So I would say that, India cannot afford to be, consuming so much of urea. We don't need, urea has 46% nitrogen. Diammonium phosphate has 18% nitrogen and 60% phosphorus. And 46% phosphorus, and MOP has 60% this thing. So we need to go in for, instead of DAP, maybe more of single superphosphate, because single superphosphate also contains sulfur, So I think these are the kind of things we need to do. And this again, how do we ensure that the nitrogen utilization, improves the nitrogen use efficiency? So one way to do it is by incorporating these urease and nitrification inhibitors. So basically this will slow down this will ensure that the nitrogen is released slowly. It doesn't convert into ammonia, and that ammonia doesn't volatilize. So basically you need you need to incorporate. You have to make this, compulsory. Just like I think they did it with the neem coating. Neem has some kind of effect of urease and nitrification inhibitor, but not. But probably, I don't know. Maybe this is a strategy. And of course, nano fertilizers. We know about very small particles. Because I think 1 millimeter is, I think, 1 million nanometers. So just think of it. I mean, I think IFCO claims that a single 500 ml bottle, containing 4% nitrogen, can replace, a bag, a 45 kg bag of urea containing 46% nitrogen. Maybe it's a little, I don't know, maybe slightly exaggerated, but probably this is the way to go. As I said, the main thing has to be input use efficiency. And yes, as I said, we should not sell urea as plain urea. Urea should be zincated. Urea should be sulfur coated. And make it compulsory. I mean, you should not allow any DAP or anything to be sold as DAP, because remember that India doesn't have any rock phosphate. India doesn't have any potash. India doesn't have any elemental sulfur reserves. So I think this is something which we need to do. And then, of course, even nitrogen fixing, the green manure crops, which will again reduce the dependence on chemical fertilizers. So I think this is what so if you can harvest same or more yields with fewer bags, so I think that has to be the essential strategy of the evergreen revolution. Not more input, more output. That is not going to work. It has to be less input and more output, by ensuring that the input is used efficiently, and accordingly we have to design new fertilizers, maybe new customized fertilizers, which can be this thing. And yeah, this is my last slide, and I think the challenges today are far more complex than, in during the time of Dr. Swaminathan. Of course, at the time, and one should not say that it was not. So at that time, it was basically, giving more water and more fertilizers. So which means what? Basically expanding irrigation and basically setting up more fertilizer plants. Whereas now, probably during his time, climate change was not much of a issue. Like whereas we have seen what happened to the wheat crop last year. I mean, the 2000. So in 2022-23, it was unseasonal rains in March. In 2022, it was a sudden temperature surge, right? So basically now it calls for heavy investments in climate smart breeding, including through all other whether it is biotechnology, whether it is gene modification. As we have seen, Dr. Swaminathan was very adventurous. He had no problem in commercializing any new variety. I mean, I think the scientists then took a lot of risks. Right. And so basically today we need a champion for agriculture, not one champion. You need like I think the Green Revolution one was a result of the 3 S's, right? You had Dr. Swaminathan, you had Mr. Shivaraman, Mr. Bhutalingam, and Mr. Subramaniam, right? I mean, so you had the civil servant, you had the minister, and you had the scientists, and whereas that I think is missing today. Not many people in India know who the agriculture minister today is, right? And there are no Dr. Swaminathans today. So I think the greatest tribute we can pay to Dr. Swaminathan is hoping for a new champion in this thing, and who believes in science, and is able to inspire belief in science, whereas I think probably in those that kind of scientific temper, and how to bring it in agriculture, I think that's very important. We are very open to scientific temper in space, in moon and in Mars, etc., but not in Earth. We need to be down to earth, and that is where I think we can learn a lot from Dr. Swaminathan. So I think I'll end my presentation here. Was it very long?
It was fabulous, Harish, as we had hoped and expected, with lots of smatterings of existing knowledge about prices of various pulses. And tomatoes so in true Harish spirit. You also, through your talk, brought out so much of CPR spirit. One of the things that we speak so much about here in the institution is this big question of how do we rejuvenate, and strengthen public institutions and their role in enabling the kind of revolution that Dr. M.S. Swaminathan enabled. So much of what you say resonates.
Yeah, it was a symphony, as Dr. Swaminathan kept emphasizing. Symphony. Everyone moving in sync. Whether it is a civil servant, whether it is a scientist, whether it is a politician. Everybody together. So I think that is missing today in agriculture, probably.
Absolutely missing across many parts of the Indian state. But thank you so much. This really was an absolutely brilliant tour de force of Dr. Swaminathan, the Green Revolution, and a wonderful summary of the big challenges we face as we hope to move towards the Evergreen Revolution. Open to questions, comments. Floor is open. We'll take some from Zoom as well. My colleague Vanika will send me questions. So please feel free to drop in your questions to the audience on Zoom. And may I just request you to use the mic? Arnaz.
Good evening, sir. It was a wonderful experience hearing you. My name is Shivam. It was a very beautiful talk. You talked of 3 S, and one of them was civil servant. I think I read somewhere even Swaminathan, MS sir was earlier into IPS before he got into science, and I think it was a blessing for all of us. One more thing, sir. You mentioned how you very beautifully described MS Swaminathan sir as the Krishna, and how he had a large view ahead. So my question is that I was just curious, if MS sir was active today, if he was in his 30s like before, which areas do you think he would have worked upon and he would have focused upon?
I think climate would have been the natural choice for him, because the kind of the thing. See, we need somebody who thinks strategically, agriculture, who has a strategic vision for agriculture. We should know what is going to happen next 10 years, next 25 years, and various scenarios. What will be the temperatures like? What is the water availability? So I think he combined in himself all these things. As I said, he was not a great breeder. I mean, of course, he understood, but none of the varieties, whether it was Kalyan Sona or this thing, were a result of his breeding. Dr. Kush was a great breeder, okay, and Dr. Mathur and Dr. Kohli, etc., were great breeders. Whereas I think Dr. Swaminathan's greatness was he understood science, right? He knew what is happening in the world, right? I mean, imagine in the 60s, 50s, reading about Dr. Vogel and communicating with him. Those days there was no email, no WhatsApp, nothing, right? I mean, so the letters had to go, it was snail mail, right? I mean, it had to go there, so I think the ability to network, network with scientists there, network, and then go and sit in the IARI fields, sit with the breeders, and then and then talking to the minister, getting Indira Gandhi. So I think he was a complete man. I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, the only person I can think of in the same league is Dr. Verghese Kurian, so I think we need somebody of that stature, somebody whom the Prime Minister can listen and will listen to, and whereas I think that is something which is missing, and similarly, there are not many politicians today who understand agriculture, feel for agriculture, and we need to, not just because it employs about whatever 45% of Indian this thing, but also because we need to feed this country, right? I mean, so we should have some idea of what is happening, and agriculture is going to be the real, I mean, the climate change, the impact of it is going to be very huge. So my feeling is, if Dr. Swaminathan was alive and if he was in the 30s, I think climate smart breeding would have been his focus area. I believe so. And I don't think he ever joined the IPS. Even I read about it, but he never joined. I mean, all I know is that he passed the exam. Maybe Mr. Bhuthalingam, did he join? Did he ever join the service? I don't think so.
He got an offer.
Okay.
He declined.
Yeah.
He did get an offer.
Yeah. So I think he preferred potatoes rather than, and then later on, yeah.
Amazing. Nothing like a good
and then wheat.
potato.
Yeah.
Meghla? Here. Sorry.
Thanks, Harish, and I think Yamini summed it all up. And I think there are a number of questions. I think the main thrust and I think the point about public agriculture is so important in terms of agricultural universities. I think your point about science, also coordination, right? The
Correct.
amount of coordination. So, I mean, one of the things we've been saying in our writings is also that, I think Dr. Swaminathan himself saw in the Green Revolution and foresaw the problems that would come. And of course,
Absolutely.
they have come in a big way. But that foresight, so it's an interesting question. Why did we not act earlier in like the 80s, once it all started becoming quite clear what happened in the 60s and 70s? I'm still confused about that period where that foresight was there in the 60s itself, that going down this path for this long will not work. And before we come to climate smart, which is now, there was this period in the 70s, late 70s, 80s, 90s. It's a genuine confusion as to how we couldn't see then and move. Like, I think, the fact that even today we've talked a lot about this procurement system, these are all things that stayed for so long. That did we just bet on it? It worked and we stayed with it, and then there was no movement. So just a little thought on what would it have taken, because of course there were very active people around that time as well. And was it just, in your sense, that the interests around wheat and rice had gone so deep? The problem that we needed to move to nutrition security was already well understood. These are not things of the 2000s plus. This is, so that one question I had, which was on this period, right post it, what was going on and why we couldn't have moved out and transitioned. Like we, at CPR, we talk a lot about the fact that we don't plan and navigate these transitions. And we did not do that. And now we have to face a whole range of other problems. And then the second question, you've talked a lot about public agricultural universities and science. And I think you said it in such a charming and interesting way. That he used connections, and of course there was an alignment, and there was also a genuine crisis. So your comparison with COVID, and that in a crisis you cannot follow the same regulatory protocols that you would in other times. But part of the challenge we face today is outside crisis. We still don't seem to have one of the big weaknesses for us to be able to use science with confidence is to have a regulatory system or process that builds trust at a time when there's a lot more scientific information and a lot more contestation about possible risks and, from all sides. So, in a different way for the future, how does one build, or do we have examples of where better decision making can be taken in a much more complex environment outside of a crisis, where you don't have to travel roughshod over process in a sense, right?
I'm just going to add one more question to Meghla's questions, because I think they are related and you'll end up covering both. So this is from Zoom, which from Nivedita Khandekar, which says, sorry, I do need to get my glasses out to be able to do this right. Apologies. Looking back now, many people say the emphasis on food security vis-a-vis rice and wheat came at the cost of sturdy grains that India had. Now that we face all these multiple challenges of climate change, erratic rainfall, increased heat, do you think it was a wrong decision to neglect the hardy indigenous grains? So I think it also links back to this question that Meghla posed of, why after that big for a step forward that we took in the 60s, we just sort of didn't build on the innovation and the science.
Well, I would say that India didn't become self-sufficient in even basic food grains till the late 90s, because it was not as though, by early 70s, you had already become self-sufficient. Yeah. So I would say that because most of the spread, the Green Revolution started, we know, in Punjab, Haryana, etc. And maybe a bit of coastal Andhra and the Kaveri basin of Tamil Nadu. But the revolution actually spread only during the 80s, in Bengal and other the thing. And I think that throughout that period, we were still, it was, I mean, we were very finely balanced. It was not as though we were very surplus or anything. So I think so therefore naturally, I think policymakers were still looking at ways to increase production. So to that extent, you can say it was a very short-termist kind of thing, and that strategy probably continued for a very long time, So if you look at it, I would say that in the 1990s we became surplus in rice and wheat. And then I think in the maybe also sugar. So basically your calories, right? Calories and carbohydrates, we became surplus by say early 2000. Then the private sector entered. So if you see the protein and micronutrient revolution came entirely through the private sector. If you leave out milk was of course NDDB and Amul, etc. Right? I mean, Operation Flood, but your entire your eggs and the thing. So I think by 2000s, the private sector had taken over, and during this period, I think the public sector sort of exited. It kind of gave way. So probably I think that was a very big reason why this happened. So I think by that time, I think the state capacity, the state including thinking strategically, I think had disappeared by then. It was I mean, it was hollowing out. You can see, like, even your agricultural universities, IRI, etc. Going downhill. Whereas ideally government should be investing in the future. It should be, the government should be like Lord Krishna, right? I mean, and the private sector obviously will go by the market forces. So I think it is a combination of that. The fact that we were not yet self-sufficient, we were not yet surplus probably till the 1990s, and by which time I think the private sector, the private corporates came in a big way. So I think that is what happened. And I suppose the effects of climate change are being really felt. I mean, as far as agriculture is concerned, only in the last 10 years. Earlier when you talked of climate, it was only basically monsoon failure, right? But we never heard about short winters, right? Short winters and extreme rainfall events, right? Fewer rainy days, but extreme precipitation. These, I think, have really happened in the last 10 years. I mean, I think the data also shows that. So probably that has to do with the unique thing about climate change. The effects start showing, the cumulative, and during this period then you have ignored. So it's definitely a failure, I think, in the case of the government, and the inability. And probably by then, somebody like Dr. Swaminathan had already grown too old, and others probably couldn't understand it. It's not that there are some scientists, very fine scientists, who think strategically. In fact, I would say that more and more scientists should come into this policy area, not leave it entirely to economists and to bureaucrats. Whereas I think many scientists, what I see is they are very afraid to speak on policy issues. Whereas whereas Dr. Swaminathan was someone, he was very comfortable meeting anyone. So I think that is something which is very important. We have given too much of space to economists and to other thing. Whereas the economists, as Dr. Swaminathan said, Dr. V.K. R.V. Rao was very skeptical. Why do we need this whatever new seeds, etc. They were all resisting, whereas he was the man who was willing to take risks. So probably I think but now I think is the time when we we can develop enough state capacity, and there is no alternative. And this is also a crisis, and the Indian state, yes, as you said, we work well in crisis. And now, if you have a climate, an extra extreme event every year, then automatically, I think the crisis will make you start looking, this kind of a thing, and that is something which is very important, I think.
But I think at the heart of that is also the issue that Meghla has raised often too, and we have so often in our conversations about the urgency of recognizing agriculture as a critical sector of the economy. The 1990s was very much a story of get them out of agriculture and that will be the future, without thinking about agriculture per se. Yeah.
Thank you, Yamini. I wanted to, you said two things that really struck me. I should tell you that I knew Dr. Swaminathan from the late 60s. And it's a long story, which is not, I won't go to that. But I was really very fond of him. I worshipped him in many ways. But one of the things you said touched me, and I want to enlarge on it slightly, about that this idea of looking ahead, that he saw and he foresaw, he managed to put diverse trends and to see where they would lead and how they could be, in a sense, synthesized to the benefit of the country. There was a reason for this. I've never in my life met a person of such great scholarship who was so truly humble. By humility, what I'm referring to is the fact that when a new idea came up that was not his idea in his field, he didn't feel threatened. On the contrary, he jumped at it, he grabbed it, and he promoted not only the idea, but the person who put the idea. This kind of intellectual generosity is something that, frankly, in my very long life now, I'm now going to be 85, wow, I have very, very rarely ever come across. And Dr. Swaminathan had it, and I encountered it over and over again. I want to give you one very small, brief personal anecdote. At the end of the 70s, when the price of oil had gone straight through the roof, I was editor of the Financial Express at that time, and I was wondering if there's any alternate way of making transport fuels. And I came across, long story how it happened, came across a New Zealand project for using forestry residues, for gasifying it and using it to make transport fuels. And then did some more work and so on. In India, we found that, of course, we were deforesting away like mad. So was there an alternative biomass source from which you could do it? And the only one I could think of was municipal solid waste, which, you've got these mountains at the two ends of Delhi. They're just solid waste because you don't have the brains to know what to do with them. Well, I took the idea to Dr. Swaminathan that we could gasify this. I'd done a fair amount of work and actually gone around the world once to about 4 or 5 places where they were experimenting with this. So I came back in, and he was then Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission in 81, 82. So in 82, I brought that to him, and I made a suggestion to him, and he said, come and give a talk at the Planning Commission. And I explained the idea, which was that you get rid of the inorganics from the solid waste, dry it to the appropriate extent, which is that you should maintain about 25% moisture from the 40 to 50 as average. And then you can, if you gasify that, you get carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and of course carbon dioxide. And carbon monoxide and hydrogen can be is easily synthesized into any transport fuel you want. In fact, the Germans fought the entire Second World War on the synthesis of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, but obtained from coal. So Dr. Swaminathan not merely picked up the idea, he was very, very enthusiastic. He informed all the state governments about this. He sent a thing out. And to cut a long story short, he also got me in touch with Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And I had 8 minutes. I talked to her. She said, this is a project of the highest national importance. And 10 days later, a studies team had been set up and had been put to the reports of the study team to go around and study this. That was Dr. Swaminathan, if I may say so. Unfortunately, the follow-up in the bureaucracy, I've been trying now in the past 40 years to get it. The follow-up in the bureaucracy is slightly less than zero.
Well,
I
the
say
the
less than
mountains
zero
of
because-
waste are only growing.
Because unlike Dr. Swaminathan, sorry, the first reaction in the bureaucracy that I've encountered over and over again in Maharashtra, in Punjab, and elsewhere is, what's there in it for me?
Harish, thank you for this really brilliant presentation delivered with so much enthusiasm and passion. So my question relates to not only your main theme, but during your presentation, you talked about not only agriculture, talked about milk, Dr. Kurian's revolution, briefly touched upon space well, in passing, which also has been a great success for India. And then there are others like atomic energy. So I would say the first 40 years, 30 or 40 years of India's existence as an independent nation, we had achieved fairly significant successes in agriculture, space, atomic, milk. And I would have thought that this correlation between public sector funding of science, applied science, and these four successes would have kind of developed a kind of general atmosphere that science, scientific application is the way to go really forward in a huge country like India with so many problems. But that hasn't happened in, say, health, in livestock, in forestry, several other things one can think about. So, and I've been trying to ponder in my head as you said, what do you think is the reason for this? With these successes, we should have said, wow, this is the way to go.
I think for each of these, you need a champion, right? I mean, atomic energy, we had Dr. Bhabha, and of course, later on, Dr. Sarabhai, Dr. Setna, Dr. Ramanna, Dr. P.K. Iyengar. So each of these had champions, you know, in milk, you had Dr. Verghese Kurian, right? In agriculture, you had Dr. Swaminathan, and of course, all the great legendary breeders, right? I mean, who for me are the real rock stars, you know, not just apart from the Lord Krishna, you know, there are many rock stars also who were there. So probably, I don't know, maybe forestry, etc. They have not had any champions, right? I mean, maybe that is the one reason, you know. I can't think of any other because it's not my area. I have absolutely no idea. So probably for anything, you need somebody who will, you know, do it with a missionary zeal, you know, and at the same time, you know, combines you know, idealism with a practical approach. You know, that is very important. I think maybe that is the kind of a
Is
thing.
it the urgent overshadowing the important? I mean, atomic energy was urgent, right? Agriculture,
Possible,
obviously.
definitely.
Space
You know,
for-
I might just add to this. I think one is urgent and impossible, and the important, the urgent and the important. But I think the other, you know, which is, I think is such a powerful question, is actually about temper. And we talk a lot, again, you know, Yamini was saying public institutions, about norms and values. And why after 40 years or 30 years where it was important, so important, and we'd actually nurtured institutions. And, you know, you mentioned all the breeders. Now, I think the fact is we didn't get to know their names. And the thing is that it's not, this usual story that it's a champion, right? But good institutions will create generations of leaders and champions who will lead those places. And it's not like there wasn't mentorship. There was an active effort to go and collect people from across the world in those days to actually lead some of this. So I think that the heart of your question is also, how come we didn't bet more on that?
Absolutely.
Given that we have some enormous successes led by the public sector.
No, and what is incredible is many of these institutions were built at a time when India didn't have any foreign exchange or anything. I mean, imagine setting up 8, agricultural universities. I mean, PAU and Pantnagar. I mean, we don't have anything of the equivalent today. Today we have, I don't know what, $500 billion of forex reserves. I think when you have anything in excess, I think that is the time when all this complacency, everything starts building. Whereas I think what happened during the 50s, 60s, maybe, I don't know, maybe the deterioration started in the 70s, maybe during that time. But there was a lot of, I think, importance in setting up public institutions, and thinking strategically, so.
I mean, that's such an important point, and it's particularly poignant that we are having this conversation today as against the backdrop of CPR's 50th anniversary. And I've been thinking about this a lot, also as we've been digging into the archives of this institution for a whole host of other reasons. But one of the things that has fascinated me is that I see even in CPR's the history of what enabled and this institution to set itself up had a lot to do with a public framework, a public institution imagination within the bureaucracy. And if you look over the history of this institution's correspondence with with public institutions in the bureaucracy that supported the creation of this and its financing, you also see over time the nature of this correspondence becomes increasingly bureaucratized. So it loses its sense of purpose. Usually communication with government is always about petty matters in institutional context, but those petty matters were debated within a broader imagination of what it takes to build institutions of excellence and why those petty matters need to be resolved from that purpose. Over time, it reduces itself just to the petty matters. And that's really, and I've wondered whether the 1991 privatization story, public sector being imagined as the problem rather than a part of the solution, also suddenly leaves the public institutions with very little sense of purpose. So they're holding on to power, and the only way that bureaucrats know how to hold on to power is to do what they did to you, Prem, which is to keep a good idea on a file forever and ever more and use bureaucratic structures to prevent it from actually flourishing. So it's a thought. What have we gained a lot in 1991, and we lost a whole bunch of things in the process too. And now that we have 30 years of liberalization as well, it's worth looking back to see what happened to our public institutions. But we are literally at the end of our session, but there is no event at CPR complete without Sir and his comments. So I will hand over the last word to you.
Thank you, sir.
But briefly, because we are already at 7:30.
I'll be very short. Thank you so much. Sir, I'll be going to spoken in English. I prefer speaking in Hindi if you don't mind, because I know you understand Hindi. Sir, I'm very grateful to Swaminathan ji, because he is a par excellence agro-scientist. And I value him most, but I belong to a generation, those who had to consume PL480 wheat.
Right.
Its stink is still within me. I feel it. Its taste and its stink. We were consuming the wheat that was not good even for food for the animals in the United States at that time. Believe you me, I know the feeling what it was. So this is one. We have reached a stage where the production is so much. Thanks for all that. For the science and the Swaminathan ji. अब जो कहना मैं ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि उन्होंने कुछ रिकमेंडेशंस दी है, उसके कुछ सिंपल आपने उस बारे में नहीं बोला, उसके बारे में बोला, थोड़ा बोल देते तो अच्छा होता। उनकी रिकमेंडेशन के इम्प्लीमेंटेशन का क्या हुआ? और आज हमारे पास इतना प्रोडक्शन है, हमारे पास गोडाउन ही नहीं है, बाहर माल सड़ता है, मैं आंखों से देखा, जगह जगह सड़ता है, बीट सड़ता है, उसकी कोई कवरेज नहीं है, कोई गोडाउन नहीं है, तो हम इतना प्रोड्यूस करें कि हम उसको संभाल नहीं पा रहे। इस हालात में जबकि गोडाउन जो प्रोडक्शन है वो सड़ रही है, कोई खरीदने वाला नहीं है, और किसान आत्महत्याएं कर रहे हैं, किसान खेतों पर जो है अपनी टमाटोज फेंक रहे हैं, क्योंकि अभी महाराष्ट्र में उन्होंने प्याज जला दिए, राइट? प्रोडक्शन so much frustrations. So he made some recommendations. You should please also shed some light on that. I can go on that because that is social, so the anthropology or political question, but I don't want to dwell on that because men wouldn't like that. I hope you shed some light. Why so much production, no godowns, and the things are rotting, and people are burning and frustrated. What's going on? And committing suicides.
सर, प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी ने बहुत सही बोला कि डॉक्टर एम एस स्वामीनाथन कृषि वैज्ञानिक नहीं थे, किसानों का वैज्ञानिक थे, है ना? तो ही ऑलवेज थॉट नॉट ओनली इन टर्म्स ऑफ एग्रीकल्चर बट ऑल्सो ऑफ द फार्मर. तो इसीलिए जो है वो जो कमीशन जो था, इट वाज कॉल्ड नेशनल कमीशन ऑफ फार्मर्स, इट वाज नॉट कॉल्ड नेशनल कमीशन ऑफ एग्रीकल्चर. तो आई थिंक जो भी सोल्यूशन हमें जो सोचना चाहिए, हमें पहले जो है किसानों को यू हैव टू मेक देम एट द सेंटर. ओके, लेकिन तो जो भी पॉलिसी जो बनाएंगे, सो आई थिंक डॉक्टर स्वामीनाथन वाज नॉट जस्ट अ साइंटिस्ट, ही वाज एबल टू पुट द फार्मर एट द सेंटर स्टेज. तो अगर आज हमें लग रहा है कि बहुत ज्यादा हम लोग प्रोड्यूस कर रहे हैं, वैसे वो सब चले गए, अभी तो हमारे पास स्टॉक्स ज्यादा है नहीं, इट इज अगेन बैक टू डेफिसिट एक्सेट्रा. लेकिन वी नीड समथिंग to ensure that the farmer remains in business. So वो कैसे करेंगे? Maybe you give him some kind of a cash transfer, because see, agriculture is not just about producing. Agriculture is also, imagine अगर ये सारा field, अगर यहाँ पे building आ जाएंगे, सब कुछ आ जाएगा, it will be like, I know in my state the floods happen, ये सब because the fields have disappeared. See, fields are also a way in which your water recharge takes place. So we need some way of, even if we think that we are in surplus, which I don't think so, but if we think that we are in surplus, we should still ensure that we need some kind of a land planning, that it should not be that farmers should have the incentive to continue in agriculture and maintain the land for agriculture, because agriculture is, apart from growing crops, it's also recharging water, which is very important. So agar hum log farmer ko center mein karenge, so I think many problems can be solved, whereas I think the problem is when we think that the farmer is a problem, whereas if you look at the farmer, so I think that is what Dr. Swaminathan was. So isliye what Modi ji said is very correct. He was not just a krishi vijnanik, but he was a kisanon ka vijnanik. So I think that is the
On that note, Harish, thank you very much. As always, you have provoked us, you have encouraged us, and we've had such a wonderful conversation that started with thinking about agriculture, but really has actually captured the political economy and some of the big questions that we confront today. Really grateful. Thank you.
Thanks.